The disturbing history of human experimentation. Every year, thousands of medical breakthroughs save lives. But what if I told you that some of those breakthroughs were built on the backs of unimaginable suffering? Throughout history, human experimentation has pushed the boundaries of science, but at an unspeakable cost. The idea of experimenting on human beings sends a chill down most of our spines, conjuring images of cold, sterile laboratories and helpless victims. Yet throughout history, such experiments have occurred time and time again. Some were born out of desperation to advance medicine. Others, however, were driven by greed, cruelty, or blind ambition. Human experimentation is not just a relic of the distant past. It raises critical ethical questions we still wrestle with today. How far can science go? What justifies experimenting on one life to save another? And who decides the boundaries of right and wrong? To understand these questions, we need to delve into some of the darkest chapters in human history, where these boundaries were not only blurred, they were obliterated. The problem with human experimentation has always been its cost, not in dollars or resources, but in dignity, consent, and basic human rights. Ethical guidelines, like the Nuremberg Code or the Declaration of Helsinki, exist today precisely because of the horrors that occurred when those rights were ignored. The heart of the issue lies in the violation of autonomy. Consent is the cornerstone of modern medical ethics, but for much of history, it was a foreign concept. People, often the most vulnerable in society, became unwilling participants in experiments that were invasive, dangerous, and at times, outright inhumane. Take, for instance, the ethical dilemma. Can knowledge gained from cruel experiments ever be justified if it saves lives? Or does using that knowledge perpetuate the suffering of the victims? The scars of this question run deep, and nowhere is this more evident than in the infamous cases of human experimentation throughout history. One of the most notorious examples is the Tusc syphilis study, which began in 1932 in the United States. African-American men, many of whom were impoverished sharecroppers, were told they were receiving free health care for bad blood. What they weren't told was that they were being deliberately left untreated for syphilis. Even after penicillin became widely available as a cure in the 1940s, the study continued for 40 years, leaving countless men to suffer and die, and their families devastated. The Tusc study is a grim reminder of how racism and systemic inequality can pervert science. But the horrors don't end there. In the mid-20th century, Project MUltra, a CIA program, conducted secret mind control experiments on unwitting subjects. Participants were dosed with LSD and subjected to psychological manipulation, sometimes driving them to insanity. The program, shrouded in secrecy, left behind shattered lives and questions that remain unanswered. And then there are the experiments conducted by Nazi doctors during World War II, which stand as perhaps the most horrifying chapter in the history of human experimentation. Prisoners in concentration camps were subjected to unimaginable torture under the guise of science. They were frozen to death to study hypothermia, infected with diseases to test cures, and mutilated in pursuit of racial pseudoscience. Joseph Mengele, infamously known as the Angel of Death, performed horrific experiments on children, especially twins, without anesthesia. The Nuremberg trials exposed these atrocities to the world, leading to the establishment of the Nuremberg Code, a foundational document in the field of medical ethics. A turning point in the history of human experimentation came with the revelations of the Nuremberg trials in 1947. The trials not only laid bare the horrors of Nazi experimentation, but also forced the world to confront an uncomfortable truth. Such abuses weren't limited to totalitarian regimes. The Nuremberg Code that emerged set forth 10 principles of ethical experimentation, with the first being that voluntary consent is absolutely essential. This was a watershed moment, signaling a shift in how the world viewed the balance between scientific progress and human rights. But implementing these principles was, and still is, a challenge. Take, for example, the controversial experiments conducted by the US government in the 1950s, where radiation was tested on unwitting patients, soldiers, and even children. While the Nuremberg Code existed, its enforcement was inconsistent, showing that ethical guidelines are only as strong as the systems that uphold them. Human experimentation has left a dark legacy, but it has also shaped the ethical standards we now hold dear. Every informed consent form, every patient's right to say no, and every discussion about ethics in science owes something to the lessons learned from these grim chapters in history. Yet the echoes of past violations still reverberate. Modern issues, like the use of genetic engineering, AI in healthcare, and pharmaceutical trials in developing countries, continue to test the limits of our ethical boundaries. Remembering the mistakes of the past isn't just about honoring the victims. It's about ensuring that their suffering wasn't in vain. What do you think about the ethical dilemmas surrounding human experimentation? Should knowledge gained through unethical means ever be used? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this topic intrigued you, check out our next video on the ethics of genetic manipulation. Together, we can keep the discussion alive and ensure history's darkest chapters are never repeated.